Picture this: 19 coffins being carried out of the palace gates in a single morning. 19. Not soldiers who died in battle, not criminals executed for their crimes. These were princes, young boys, some barely old enough to walk, all strangled with silk bowstrings in the span of 2 hours. And the man who ordered their deaths, their own brother, he stood watching from his window as each small body was wrapped in white cloth and carried away. One of the boys was just 3 years old. 3 years old. This wasn't ancient barbarism from thousands of years ago. This happened in 1595, when Shakespeare was writing Romeo and Juliet, when the modern world was supposedly civilized. And here's the most insane part. This mass family murder wasn't seen as evil or psychotic. It was seen as necessary, as smart, as the only logical move. Because in the Ottoman Empire there was a saying, the throne or the coffin. And on January 27th, 1595, one man chose the throne by filling 19 coffins with his own blood relatives. This is Sultan Mehmed III. He's one of the most ruthless rulers in history, a man who turned fratricide into state policy, who killed more of his own family members than any other monarch in recorded history. At just 29 years old, he orchestrated the largest royal family massacre the world had ever seen. And boy, did he enjoy the power it brought him. The Ottoman Empire at this time controlled territory spanning 3 continents, ruled over 30 million subjects, and commanded the most feared military force on earth. But how does a prince raised in luxury and education end up murdering 19 brothers before breakfast? How does someone look at their own siblings, children they grew up with, played with, shared meals with, and order their systematic execution? Little did anyone know that this shocking massacre was just the beginning. The truth behind this story involves secret messages, poison attempts, a mother's deadly ambition, and a system so brutal that it makes Game of Thrones look like a fairy tale. Welcome to the insane true story of the Ottoman Empire's bloodiest succession. Mehmed was born in 1566 inches Manisa, where his father, the future Sultan Murad III, served as provincial governor. But here's the crucial part. From the moment he took his first breath, Mehmed knew he was living under a death sentence. You see, the Ottoman Empire had a unique problem. With polygamy and multiple concubines, sultans often had dozens of sons. Murad III himself had over 100 children. 100. And Ottoman law was clear. There could only be one sultan. The moment Mehmed's father died, every single one of his brothers would become a mortal enemy. It was an early lesson for Mehmed that family meant nothing when it came to power. The young prince would later reflect on his childhood and say that every meal could be his last, every night's sleep might never see morning. The Ottoman palace, despite its golden halls and marble fountains, was a prison where brothers were kept separated, watched constantly, and trained to see each other not as siblings but as future corpses. Mehmed's mother, Safiye Sultan, was different from the other concubines. She was calculating, brilliant, and absolutely ruthless. She would whisper to young Mehmed as she tucked him into bed, "The throne or the coffin, my son. There is no middle ground." She began positioning him from childhood, using her influence to ensure he received the best education, the most loyal tutors, and most importantly, that he was appointed to govern the prestigious province of Manisa, the traditional post for the heir apparent. But Mehmed showed signs early on that he was different from his brothers. While they studied poetry and calligraphy, he studied his father's advisors, memorizing their weaknesses, their desires, their fears. At age 12, he witnessed his first execution, a vizier who had plotted against his father. While other children might have been traumatized, Mehmed studied the man's face as the silk cord tightened around his throat. He must have thought, "This is power, this is survival." His tutors noticed his unusual fascination with Ottoman succession history, particularly the reign of Mehmed the Conqueror, who had legalized fratricide with his famous law. "Whichever of my sons inherits the Sultanate, it is appropriate for him to kill his brothers for the common benefit of the world." Most princes hoped this law would never be enforced. Mehmed memorized every word. The truth is, Mehmed's path to power began long before his father's death. Using these new connections his mother had cultivated, he built a network of informants throughout the palace. Janissary commanders, palace eunuchs, even his brother's own servants. They all reported back to Mehmed. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1594, Sultan Murad III began showing signs of illness. The palace doctors whispered it was diabetes, but others suspected poison. Mehmed saw an opportunity here. He began sending secret messages to key military commanders, promising them positions and wealth when he became sultan. Not if, when. The confidence was crucial. You see, the Ottoman succession wasn't just about being the oldest son. It was about being the first son to reach the capital after the sultan's death and seize the throne. Geography mattered as much as genealogy. Mehmed made sure he had the fastest horses, the most loyal messengers, and spies in every major city between Manisa and Constantinople. But Mehmed's brothers weren't idle. Prince Mahmud, governing in Anatolia, had assembled his own army. Prince Selim controlled the treasury in Konya. Each brother was preparing for the coming storm. Using his mother's influence, Mehmed managed something brilliant. He convinced his father to recall several brothers to the palace for their own safety due to threats of rebellion. In many ways, it was such an incredibly simple move, but it was the meticulous planning that made it possible. These brothers thought they were being protected. In reality, they were being gathered for slaughter. By December 1594, 19 of Mehmed's brothers were in the palace, essentially prisoners in golden cages. The stage was set. All Mehmed needed now was for his father to die. On January 16th, 1595, Sultan Murad III drew his last breath. But here's the crucial part. Safiye Sultan, Mehmed's mother, kept the death secret for 12 hours. 12 hours that would determine who lived and who died. What the other princes didn't realize was that Mehmed had positioned riders every 10 miles between Manisa and Constantinople. A relay system that could deliver messages faster than anyone thought possible. Within 3 hours of his father's death, while the body was still warm, Mehmed knew. He was already mounting his horse while his brothers slept peacefully in the palace, unaware their father was dead, unaware their death warrants had already been signed. Mehmed arrived at the palace before dawn on January 27th. The Janissary Guard, already bought with promises of a massive pay increase, opened the gates. The chief executioner, a man named Sofu Mehmed, had been awakened and given his orders. Silk bowstrings, the traditional method for executing royalty, had been prepared. 19 of them. What happened next was executed with military precision. Mehmed now had absolute power, and this is very different from anything we can imagine today. His word wasn't just law, it was divine mandate. The executions began at sunrise. The youngest brother, Prince Ahmed, was 3 years old. He was playing with wooden soldiers when the executioners entered. He thought they had come to play a game. The oldest, Prince Mahmud, was 20. He fought back, managing to wound one executioner before 3 others held him down. Each brother was strangled in their room, their bodies immediately wrapped and removed. The entire operation took less than 2 hours. Some tried to hide. Prince Mustafa was found cowering behind a curtain. Prince Osman attempted to climb out a window. Prince Ibrahim wrote a desperate letter to Mehmed, begging for mercy, promising to support his rule. The letter was later found in his dead hand, unread. But here's what nobody expected. Mehmed didn't stop with his brothers. He also ordered the execution of 7 pregnant concubines who were carrying his father's children. Future rivals had to be eliminated before they were even born. When the morning's work was done, Mehmed had killed more family members in a single day than any ruler in Ottoman history. The problem was, Mehmed had now created a reputation that would haunt his entire reign. Yes, he had eliminated all rivals, but he had also traumatized an empire. The people of Constantinople watched the funeral procession of 19 princes with a mixture of awe and horror. Mothers throughout the empire began telling their children, "Be good, or Sultan Mehmed will come for you." But the fratricide didn't stop there. Power, as Mehmed discovered, was like an addiction. The more you had, the more you needed. He began seeing threats everywhere. A vizier who questioned his judgment, executed. A janissary commander who was too popular with his troops, strangled. His own son showed too much ambition. Mehmed had him watched day and night. The Sultan became increasingly paranoid, rarely leaving the palace, testing his food for poison, sleeping in a different room each night. Little did Mehmed know that his greatest threat wasn't from rebellious subjects or ambitious viziers. It was from within his own mind. The guilt of what he had done began to manifest in strange ways. Palace servants reported that he would wake up screaming, calling out his brothers' names. He claimed to see their ghosts in mirrors, in shadows, in the faces of children playing in the palace gardens. However, back in the provinces, people were starting to ask questions about a sultan who had murdered 19 brothers but couldn't win a single military victory. The empire that had once made Europe tremble was now losing territory on all fronts. Then in 1603, something happened that would seal Mehmed's fate. His eldest son, Prince Mahmud, died suddenly. Some say it was smallpox. Others whispered that Mehmed, paranoid about his son's growing popularity, had him poisoned. But the death of Mahmud broke something in the Sultan. He had become the very monster he had feared as a child, a killer of family, a destroyer of his own bloodline. For Mehmed, as the consequences of his bloodthirsty reputation started to come out, he faced rebellions in Anatolia, defeats in Hungary, and economic crisis at home. The janissaries who had once supported him now demanded higher pay with each passing year, essentially holding the empire hostage. His mother, Safiye Sultan, who had orchestrated so much of his rise, was now the real power behind the throne, making decisions while Mehmed retreated further into paranoia and madness. By December 1603, Mehmed was a shadow of his former self. Obese from years of palace indulgence, plagued by nightmares, and abandoned by allies, he died on December 22nd at just 37 years old. Some historians believe he was poisoned by his own mother, who saw him as a liability. Others say his heart simply gave out, crushed under the weight of guilt and paranoia. As for Mehmed, he died alone in his chamber, calling out for brothers who had been dead for 8 years. His last words, according to palace records, were, "They're here. They've come for me." The empire celebrated his death with 3 days of festivities. The man who had killed 19 brothers to secure his throne left behind a weakened empire and a legacy of blood that would forever stain Ottoman history. Ultimately, though, the people who suffered most were not just Mehmed's murdered brothers, but the entire Ottoman Empire. What is clear is this mass fratricide was an example of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, how a system that encourages family members to kill each other for power will eventually destroy itself from within. The Ottoman Empire never fully recovered from Mehmed's reign. His son Ahmed I, traumatized by watching his father's paranoia, abolished the practice of royal fratricide, instead implementing a system where princes were kept in the golden cage, luxurious imprisonment rather than death. But the damage was done. The empire that had once conquered Constantinople and threatened Vienna was now seen as barbaric, weak, and divided. Reports suggest that towards the end, Mehmed had gone from a calculating prince who saw murder as necessity to a broken man haunted by the faces of dead children. The 3-year-old brother he had strangled appeared in his dreams every night, asking, "Why?" a question Mehmed could never answer. Modern historians see Mehmed III as a cautionary tale about the price of absolute power. His story shows us that when a political system makes murder a legitimate path to power, it doesn't create strong leaders, it creates psychopaths. Today, we look at political dynasties and succession crises with constitutions and laws. But we should remember that these safeguards exist because of men like Mehmed III, who showed us what happens when power is won through blood rather than merit, when family bonds are sacrificed for political gain. Now, whilst the story of Sultan Mehmed III is pretty horrific, I still wouldn't call him the most psychotic ruler in history. For that, You're going to want to check out the absolutely insane story of Emperor Caligula, who didn't just kill his family, he declared war on the sea, made his horse a consul, and turned the Roman Empire into his personal torture chamber. The things he did make Mehmed look merciful by comparison. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.